I'm going to talk about the main themes in my book, Ground Control, but I'm also going to update it a bit to discuss the situation that we're facing in Britain today, and actually particularly in London, where some of the property dynamics issues are at their most extreme. So as you've already heard, I wrote the book in 2009, and it came out again in 2012 with a new edition. Just to tell you a little bit about me, my background's in journalism, actually. I worked on the Financial Times, and I've written for The Guardian for many, many years. And I want to flag up, actually, something about journalism before I start telling you about the book. Because actually, while I was working as a journalist and writing regularly for The Guardian, I actually found it very, very difficult to get quite a lot of the stories I featured in Ground Control into the national press. And I think that's an important point, because it just shows you how constricted our media actually is, and how difficult it is to have a healthy, proper debate in our media. Of course, once the book came out and it was seen to be successful, The Guardian were more than happy to feature the things that I was writing about. So I think that's just sort of something important to bear in mind. I'm now also at a university, at the University of East London, where I'm in the architecture department. And this is my pitch, actually, for new students with a new master's course starting in September called Reading the Neoliberal City. So if you're interested in what we're talking about, think about that. We hope it's going to be a proper centre for really genuinely critical thinking, which I think is very much lacking, not only in journalism, but also, I hate to say, in parts of academia. Certainly not here, of course. So just to tell you a little bit about Ground Control, actually, I very much tried to write a book that wasn't academic. What I wanted to do was to take what are often considered specialist subject areas in planning, housing, architecture, design, but which are very often obscured by jargon and actually seem quite impenetrable and difficult for people to understand. You know, terms like Section 106 and the language of social housing, and how difficult that we'll talk a little bit more about the Orwellian language that now seems to litter this field. But what I wanted to do was actually bring some of these really important debates, which do happen in academic circles, but just weren't being heard at all, and bring those out into the mainstream and get behind the jargon and take a sort of investigative journalistic approach to some of these topics, but of course at the same time remaining quite rigorous and making sure that actually it was also academically rigorous. So I was trying to sort of tread that balance with the book. We've heard that it came out in 2009, and I rewrote it, the first chapter, to come out to write about the developments associated with the Olympics. And I think it's important just to talk about the changing context, because actually it's the changing context for the dynamics of our cities and how our cities are changing. When I first started thinking about the book in 2006, 2007, it was a very, very different period. The first line of the book is, this book was written in a boom, this book was conceived in a boom and published in a bust. So when I was researching it, I was visiting cities like Liverpool and Manchester, all around Britain. We were in the throes of this huge construction boom, and we were creating this new kind of city, this new privatised city that I'm going to talk to you about today. But then in 2008, all of that came to an abrupt end with the financial crisis. And actually, I ended the book on a note of cautious optimism, thinking that perhaps the financial crisis would surely give us pause and make us look again at this model, which was very much based on debt. It was a very debt-based model of property-led development. And I thought, surely with the crisis, you know, we're going to start to look at how to do things differently. But then when it came to thinking about the new chapter and the developments associated with the Olympics in 2011, what I saw actually was that these trends had actually, if anything, were getting even worse. And today, the boom is back, actually, and what I call the Boris boom in London and the housing crisis in London and actually in the whole of the south, much of the south of England, is showing us that, you know, far from looking at alternatives, we've actually moved into a even more extreme capitalistic direction. But I think it's important to bear that changing context in mind while we have this discussion. And of course, the context is going to change again in ways that we can't predict now, but it certainly will. That's what we can be certain of. Whether it goes even more extreme or whether we actually do start to look at alternatives, who can say? So the key themes in the book, I'll just run through them. I look very much at this idea of post-industrial change, the change that accompanied the new economy, the economy of the post-industrial landscape, the empty docksides and factory spaces and warehouses. Here in Cardiff, of course, you've got Cardiff Bay. In London, we've got the docks. Cities like Manchester and Liverpool, which had been the industrial heartlands of Britain, which then fell into serious decline as industry left, and then offered themselves up actually a huge opportunity for new development. And it was this huge wave in construction that I talked about in 2006-07, which really saw these places really developing all over the country. But what were we creating? Well, under the guise of this term regeneration, which is one of the many Orwellian terms to characterize this field. What does regeneration actually mean? Well, what I argue in the book is that it means this privatized model of development where everywhere comes to look the same, where places are increasingly characterized actually by exclusion, and that I also argue that we're, as a result of this pattern of development, the way we're creating our cities, we're creating a growing culture of fear in society and a growing fear of crime, which is created by the lack of trust which we're fostering in our cities. And then I also talk about this idea of happiness, and actually I argue that this growing culture of fear and lack of trust is undermining happiness. Bringing the debates up to date, as I said earlier, I'm also in the talk going to talk about the housing crisis today and actually what is effectively the death of affordable housing, council housing, social housing, whatever you want to call it. If there was an Orwellian term, it is affordable housing, which now basically means anything but housing which is affordable. Certainly in London, where actually the definition of affordable housing today is now housing which is up to 80% of market rent. And with London prices, that's certainly not affordable, not for most of us in this room, I can tell you. So this is the boom that I was describing to you in 2006-07. This, for any of you that might recognise it, the centre of Liverpool, soon to become Liverpool 1, 34 streets, 43 hectares in the heart of Liverpool, now entirely privately owned, privately controlled by the Duke of Westminster's property company, Grosvenor, policed by private security, the sort of development that characterises the privatisation of public space, which is such a big theme in the book and today's talk. So, what I'm going to be talking about now in the first section of the talk is this idea of the privatised city. So I've also included this image here, quite different from Liverpool 1 actually. I don't know if any of you have any idea where this is. It's actually a little development called Cardinal Place, which is just behind Victoria Station in London, owned by Land Securities, another privately owned development, usual private security, CCTV, etc. The reason I've put this image in here is because what I'm trying to say is that actually all new development in Britain's towns and cities, whether large like Liverpool 1, Cabot Circus, St David's, or small like this, all new development has followed this privately owned, privately controlled template, which the template for which is Canary Wharf and the Broadgate Centre, built during the late 1980s. Now, during the late 1980s, these places actually were built as a result of the Big Bang in 1986, the deregulation of finance, which is responsible, actually, I would say, for so many of the economic crises that we've faced over the last few years. Big Bang necessitated the need for huge banks with enormous trading floors, which wouldn't fit into the tight street pattern of the square mile of the City of London. So these big banks located in the former spaces of industry, the Docklands, Canary Wharf, and created these new centres of finance. And these were the first places which were built on this privately owned, privately controlled model. But what I'm trying to draw attention to is the fact that these places were built in the image of business to meet the needs of business. But what we saw happen over the following 10, 15 years is that actually this became the model for regeneration in every part of the city. Alongside the privately owned places, we've also got another model of private control of space, which has been the importation of business improvement district companies, which we've imported from America. And this is another way of handing over the control of space to private companies. And very often these two models overlap, and you may in fact get business improvement districts running the privately owned places. And it's very difficult actually to know who runs what, because what really characterises these so-called private-public partnerships is that actually lines of accountability are blurred. And actually it creates a very different idea of the city, one where we're looking primarily at place as a product, and it's a far less democratic idea of the city. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more depth. And another point I really want to emphasise is that actually, sometimes people say to me, well, look, if Grosvenor is going to invest £1 billion in rebuilding the centre of Liverpool, shouldn't we let them have control of the streets and public places if that's what they want? Well, actually, my answer to that is that the private sector has been quite happily investing in our cities for generations, as they do all across Europe. And that has not required the private ownership, the private control of streets. What we've seen actually is that local authorities have actually been abandoning their democratic responsibilities to our cities and our streets and us, in fact. And it's not at all necessary. So that's something I want to flag up. And this isn't actually something that's come at the behest of the private sector. It's actually come, I would say, as a failing of local government in particular. So here we go, Cabot Circus. This is the privately owned open-air mall in the centre of Bristol. And some critics call these places malls without walls. So it's not the traditional, more old-fashioned model of the shopping mall. It's an open-air mall. So it's quite difficult to know, are you in a mall? Are you in a street? It's really difficult to know where you are. But what is becoming increasingly a defining characteristic, that wherever they are, these places, whether they're in Bristol, in Liverpool, in Cardiff, actually they all look the same. There's nothing about these places which reflects the local area that you're in. And in fact, that's how they're created. For example, in Bristol, you can take the M32 motorway straight into Cabot Circus, park in the underground car park, come up, do your shopping, spend the day there, go back into the car park, and actually have no idea that you've spent the day in Bristol. These places are created as regional economic centres to pull in money from the region with actually little account of the cities that surround them. The economic model which has underpinned this way of doing things is called property-led or sometimes retail-led regeneration. And the main aim is to keep property prices and land values high. That's the main aim, rather than a vision of the city which might emphasise the public good and public benefit. Actually, the main aim is property prices. And it's a model that very much thrived during boom times, where property companies were able to borrow very, very large amounts of money with the aim of paying back that money through the rising property prices and the rents, the rising rents that they would be able to pull in. But actually, with the financial crisis, this model really fell apart. And all over the country, development like this stalled. And actually, it really looked like it would never get going again, because the banks ceased lending to property companies. But what we've seen in recent years, actually, we've now seen a new breed of billionaire oligarch type investor step in and bankroll this sort of development, particularly in London. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So, these private places, virtually all new development today is on this model. It's characterised by private security guards, defensible, high security architecture, and CCTV over every inch of the site, as I was proudly told at Liverpool 1, and strict rules and regulations over behaviour and access to these places, all sorts of rules about what you are or are not allowed to do, no skateboarding, cycling, rollerblading, no taking photographs, no filming, and critically, no political demonstrations. And this, for me, is the litmus test of whether or not a place is actually democratic. So political protest is not allowed in these places. And actually, all of this creates a very different public culture and public life. And I would argue a much more sterile atmosphere, more fearful places as a result. Now, what underpins all this? Well, this rather dry-looking slide is actually, I'd say, pretty important, because it actually shows you that it is specific policies which we have put in place which underpin this model of development. You know, people are often quite tempted to say, well, you know, what can we do about this? It's just simply the onward march of globalisation. That's just the way it is. Well, actually, it's not the onward march of globalisation. It is the specific putting in place of policies towards the city which enable these enormous sites to be created through powers of compulsory purchase that enable sites like Stratford City, 170 acres, 43 hectares in Liverpool, to be put together. Now, in the US, compulsory purchase is called eminent domain, and it has actually been the focus of huge political protest. A Supreme Court case in 2005, a very famous in America court case, basically saw the court decide that the term public good would be removed from legislation and would be replaced by economic benefit as the test for whether or not developments would be allowed to go ahead, whether or not eminent domain, compulsory purchase would be put in place in places. And there was huge nationwide protest at this substituting of the public good for economic benefit. Actually, it led news bulletins, books were written about it, and protesters even camped on the White House lawn. And the former President George Bush intervened personally, and actually many states in America have removed this, and the public good remains, actually its public benefit remains the benchmark test. But here, very similar changes to our planning legislation, which occurred at a similar time, actually slipped through largely unnoticed with very little discussion or debate. And unless you're a planner or somebody living in an area likely to be subject to compulsory purchase, whether in housing or because you're a small business owner, most people don't know what these terms mean at all. Okay, so just to go back to the creation of private places and what they look like, this is another place, a private enclave, also in Liverpool, but it's not Liverpool 1. And again, I wanted to show this because it's a smaller place. It's called East Village, and very often this sort of development is characterised by quite sort of Americanised sounding names, the Village, East Village. The most ridiculous one is, for me, in Manchester, where York Street actually has changed its name to New York Street, in this rather sort of ridiculous aping of Manhattan-style development. But this development is very typical of privatised places. You've got these ubiquitous bollards everywhere. These are now really very familiar parts of our urban landscape. And over here, there'll be a little plaque, and it will say private property, and maybe some of the things that aren't allowed, like no skateboarding, no cycling, and it will say CCTV is in place and contact whatever the company is which is, runs the place. But it won't say no political demonstrations or any of the other arguably more interesting things that aren't allowed in these places. So what I'm arguing actually is that what we're doing is we're creating patterns of land ownership in our cities, which are actually quite reminiscent of the Victorian, early Victorian period, before the advent of local government and local democracy. What we've seen over the last 150 years is a diverse patchwork of ownership in our high streets, where the local authority, private businesses, institutional investors, all sorts will own various parcels of land. But what we've started to see now, again, is a shift to individual private landowners owning and managing huge tracts, very similar to the Georgian and early Victorian landlords who parcelled up the city before local government and local democracy grew in power. And at this point, people often say to me, well, look, isn't this how some of our most amazing urban heritage was created? The Georgian terraces and squares, which define so many of the most beautiful parts of our cities. And indeed, that is certainly the case. This is Bedford Square in London, exactly one of these sorts of places. But what you don't see here is that this square in the 18th and early 19th century would have been surrounded by high gates and fences. Actually, there would have been sentry boxes here, security guards of the time, and the area was entirely gated off and enclosed, and the public were not allowed access to all these squares throughout London. And what you saw during the 19th century, as local government, central government, parliamentary democracy grew in power, actually there was huge public protest against the gating off of such large parts of the city. If you can imagine, you know, this was a massive issue for people. Thousands of people protested, and the result of that was that there were 2 parliamentary inquiries during the mid-19th century, and they ruled that henceforth the streets and public places of the city had to be adopted by the local authority. To use some more jargon, adopted means that the local authority runs the streets and public places of the city regardless of who may own them. And my argument is that what we're now seeing is actually the reversal of this. This was a great democratic, hard-won democratic achievement. And what we're witnessing now with the growing privatisation of the city is that this hard-won democratic achievement is going into reverse. And I think this is a extract from an essay written by an architect, Adam Caruso. The essay is called The Emotional City, and for me this sums it up really quite well. And he writes, while planning authorities may argue about facade materials and the survival of medieval street plans in the master plan, several city blocks that once housed thousands of tenants and was in the ownership of hundreds are now controlled by one owner, backed by international finance institutions. Do not be fooled by the medieval street plan, the well-maintained squares, the lunchtime activities. These developments constitute a serious erosion of democracy and the public realm. This process is taking place all over London and in all major cities. He actually wrote that in 2003. I mean, really, you know, these trends have accelerated so much more since then, and I think this puts it quite well. So, we've talked about privately owned places, the ownership of land. I'm just going to quickly tell you a little bit about business improvement districts, business improvement district companies, which really have mushroomed, actually, all over English towns and cities. There are hundreds of business improvement district companies in England. But interestingly, I was researching this as I was preparing for this talk. Wales actually has shown relative reluctance to introduce business improvement district companies, and apparently you just have two so far in Swansea and Merthyr Tydfil. So business improvement district companies run places in a very similar way to the privately owned places, with uniformed private security, CCTV, and the same rules and regulations about behaviour which is permitted or isn't permitted, and certainly no political protest and filming and those sorts of things. Certainly no begging, busking or homelessness are permitted in these areas. And in America, again, there's been a lot more debate about this than there has been over here. Actually, business improvement district companies are seen as very controversial because it's seen that they are undermining local democracy, because rather than democratically elected local authorities running places, they've been passed over to private companies to run places. But over here, we've had virtually no discussion about the merits or otherwise of business improvement district companies. What are they? Basically, local businesses pay a tax, effectively, a charge to a company to run the area in the way that the local businesses would like. So it's businesses which are running the area rather than the residents of that part of the city or the citizens of the city as a whole. And their key principles are what they would call clean and safe. And actually these principles come directly from the New York Mayor's office, and we've actually just copied them lock, stock and barrel from the New York Mayor's office. So what does clean and safe actually mean? Well, what it means is high levels of security and this real obsession with cleanliness, these state-of-the-art cleaning machines, and basically lots of uniformed officials in the environment, be they security guards, be they cleaners. And, you know, it's quite a compelling story, clean and safe, because after all, who wouldn't want to be in a clean and safe city? Who would want to live in a dirty and dangerous environment? But what I'm trying to say to you is that this is basically a cleverly thought out marketing narrative for a business management approach to the city, and what it means is this high security and extreme cleanliness. One of the developers at Westfield Stratford City actually told me that he hoped the development would come up to the streets of Westfield Stratford City would come up to the standards of any office lobby, which I think is a really bizarre aspiration for a busy central part of the city. And the impact very often actually is that you end up cleaning out the people and the activities and the excitement and the fun from places, and creating very sort of soulless environments as a result. Okay, so why am I showing this image here, which I presume most of you will recognise? This is the Occupy protest in 2011 on the steps of St Paul's Cathedral. Why were these guys on the steps of St Paul's Cathedral? Actually, they had no intention of camping outside the church, although it did in the end provide a very dramatic backdrop to the protest. They had initially wanted to base their protest here. round the corner in Paternoster Square, because the Occupy protest was actually called Occupy London Stock Exchange, and this is where the London Stock Exchange is. But of course, Paternoster Square is a privately owned, privately controlled environment, which swiftly took out an injunction against the protesters who were not allowed anywhere near it. And what actually emerged is that virtually the whole of the square mile of the City of London is now a series of privately owned estates. I told you earlier how Big Bang had unleashed the need for these private estates in Docklands and at the Broadgate Centre to accommodate the big banks. Well, what we've seen over the last 20 years is that actually this privatised model came into the City of London as well. And now the city is entirely a series of these privately owned places which ban protest. And in fact, what emerged is that the only part of the City of London where there is enough public space to cite a protest like this was the area around St Paul's Cathedral, and that's why the Occupy protest took place there. So for me, one of the sort of defining characteristics of this privatised space in the city is that political protest is not allowed, and that therefore these, to my mind, are not democratic spaces. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about security now, because security is one of the defining features of these sorts of places. And actually, I think security, which is a really complicated subject, it's a subject which relates actually very much to the way we feel about ourselves and the people around us. Actually, it's all this security which is the driving force for, actually, I would say, much more fear of crime and the undermining of trust in city spaces. So this is a security guard in Canary Wharf, done up very much to emulate the look of the police. And private estates vary in the types of security they wish to employ. Some will have kind of much more chilled out kind of look of their security guards who wear maybe green fleeces rather than police style. But essentially, wherever you are, whatever private estate you're in, there will be private security policing the area. And actually, you know, I would argue that this very much adds to the sterility of the environment and increases fear. And in a way, it seems obvious because, of course, if you're surrounded by security, you're going to constantly be reminded of danger. But security is a really difficult one, and it's a real conundrum because actually people very often want security. If you're asked, you know, would you like more security? It will make you feel safer. Most people will say, well, sure. But actually what we find and what the limited research that has been done in this area shows is that actually more security very often creates higher levels of fear. And I'm just going to take a little tangent now just to talk about security a bit because it's one of the key themes of the book and as I said, a very defining characteristic of private places. And what we've seen in this period, which we've been talking about over the last 25 years or so, is the rolling out of a policy called Secured by Design, which is a police-backed design policy which began in the late 80s, again imported from America. And what we have now seen is that actually planning permission for all new development, all public buildings, public places, housing and schools depends on minimum levels of secured by design being achieved, which means actually that all new development today has this very high level of security. And it's just been sort of snuck in, to my mind, you know, by the back door as part of a discussion of raising standards. And now we have to meet these security standards. And what does this actually mean? Well, the gating of an awful lot of housing developments inevitably comes with secured by design. high levels of CCTV, actually secured by design practitioners would argue to me that they don't necessarily favour these levels of CCTV. But what we've seen is that Britain is a magnet for CCTV. We have 4.2 million CCTV cameras in Britain, more than in the whole of Europe put together. It's a central feature of our landscape. Again, completely opposite to most European countries, especially Southern European and Scandinavian societies, where city life, I would say, is a lot more healthy and a lot less fearful. Just continuing on that CCTV theme, actually we keep rolling out new innovations, and these are drones or the unmanned aerial vehicles which were used in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that were modified in Los Angeles in 2006 for civilian use, and now fly over lots of parts of Britain. I think about a dozen police forces have now commissioned them, and they will fly over particularly when big sporting events like the Olympics, but also particularly in deprived areas. They're an extra policing tool. So this way of looking at the city, which has this level of security built into it, because private places automatically bring with them private security. And in addition to that, we have policies like secured by design, which mean whatever you're designing, you have to have minimum levels of security in your developments. My argument is that this is a way of looking at the city which actually makes a far more fearful environment. And part of the reason for this actually is that I think all of these external controls, the security guards, the CCTV cameras, actually they remove our personal and collective responsibility for our safety. Those unconscious interactions which just happen when you walk through the busy parts of the city, that eye contact between strangers, Jane Jacobs' idea of natural surveillance, that is what keeps places safe. And actually all of these controls undermine that, and therefore we're creating a far less safe environment, which is diluting trust. And the issue is actually that fear of crime does not correlate with crime figures. What it correlates directly with is trust. And all of these high security, defensible spaces actually are undermining that trust. And I think Denmark is a very good example. I think the European Crime and Safety Survey highlights actually Denmark has very similar levels of crime to the UK, which according to this survey is a consequence of urbanisation, a large population of young people and a binge drinking culture. But Denmark is also apparently the happiest country in the world with low levels of fear. It continually ranks at the top of these happiness surveys, which get all this coverage. And actually the sort of security culture that I've just briefly described to you is total anathema in Denmark, where I'm not sure if this is still the case, but certainly in recent years, CCTV on the street, for example, is actually banned in Denmark. And the sort of gating and the security guards, etc., completely unknown. So, I mean, what I've been trying to argue sort of to this point in the talk is that we're creating this very privatised environment which is causing much more segregation and fear in society. And those are some of the key themes in ground control. I'm going to step away from ground control now and paint another even more gloomy picture for you, which I just want to talk briefly about housing, because if I was updating ground control today, I would probably write about this, because actually it seems to me that these are the trends in ground control which have accelerated the most in the last year or so. And I'll talk particularly about what I'd say is the death of social housing, affordable housing, subsidised housing, public housing, whatever you want to call it. And I'll just start with telling you quickly about the Red Road flats in Glasgow. Now, I don't know if any of you remember, last year Glasgow was hosting the Commonwealth Games. And actually, the City Council, in its wisdom, decided that as part of the opening ceremony for the Commonwealth Games, they would actually knock down the Red Road flats in Glasgow live on telly, beamed to an international audience of, you know, many, many millions. And this would be a symbol of the rejuvenation of Glasgow, and it would be a great thing to include in the opening ceremony. And there was a huge outcry, and obviously this, you know, absolutely ludicrous suggestion was abandoned. I mean, people were actually living in the Red Road flats. The demolition was controversial. You know, communities had been pulled apart as a result of the demolition, which has indeed happened. But for me, the very fact that the council thought that this was a fitting idea just illustrates to me where we are with affordable housing in Britain. Now, the problem is particularly extreme in London, where literally dozens of housing estates, council estates all over London are in the process of being demolished to make way for largely luxury housing, which appeals particularly to investors and is characterised by this phenomenon which is now called buy-to-leave. Not buy-to-let, but buy-to-leave, where investors buy properties, keep them empty because they main point is to just wait for prices to rise and sell them on again. And this is really becoming a big feature of London's housing market. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about that. This is the Haygate estate in the Elephant and Castle in South London. This is 3,000 homes. This has 3,000 people, and it was demolished just before Christmas, and it will make way for this, which is called Elephant Park. And Elephant Park will be 2,500 apartments, of which 79 will be social housing. So you get some kind of idea of the change in the demographic of London, which is actually taking place at the moment. This is nearby the Haygate. This is the Aylesbury estate, another really large estate in South London, which also is soon to be demolished. And an academic called Loretta Lees has actually done some research on what happened to residents of the Haygate. Where did they go? And actually what she found is that invariably they had to move very far out. Many of them have actually had to leave London. Families have been split apart. The communities have been absolutely devastated. And in some cases, older residents have in fact died. Obviously, it's difficult to say it's as simply as a result of this, but the kind of upheaval in losing your home, you know, residents who've lived in these places for maybe 40, 50 years, elderly people having to leave. You know, this is a process which is happening all over London. It's not just the Haygate and the Aylesbury, it's the Carpenter's estate in East London, Robin Hood Gardens, the West Hendon estate in North London, the Haggerston estate also in East London, Cressingham Gardens in Lambeth. I mean, you know, the list is endless. So that's pretty much the main thrust of what I'm going to talk to you tonight. And I just want to sort of end on a quick discussion of where might we be going next. I mean, the sorts of trends I've described this evening, I would very much characterise as the architecture of boom and bust. It's an architecture which really thrived during boom times and then appeared to be on its knees as a result of the financial crisis. But now it's starting to boom again, partly because of the lax tax regulations in London, which are turning London into something like an offshore tax haven, and the role of private investors which are piling in to this tax haven, and we're seeing this housing crisis being created in London. So within that picture, is there any space for optimism? Are we likely to see alternative ways of doing things? Well, we'll just talk very briefly about that. Just to quickly tell you something about what I characterise as the Boris boom, which is what's happening in London at the moment. Actually, in some ways, I think there is a good side to all of this, which is that Boris Johnson is obviously a key contender for the Conservative Party leadership. And actually, after 2 terms as Mayor of London, that's long enough to stamp your mark on the city. And I think it's pretty clear what kind of city he has created in his image in London. So if anyone wants to know what kind of leader he would be, just look at what's been happening in London. So this Boris boom has basically seen a new kind of investment replace what had, property companies are still active. A property company like Lend-Lease, for example, is building the new Better Elephant scheme. It's not to say that property companies aren't active, but what we've seen since the financial crisis, it's a very interesting report from the estate agent Savills, which actually says that what we've started to see is that very wealthy private individuals have stepped in to fill the breach left by private companies who were unable to borrow financing from banks. So the Savills report states that since the debt crisis, private individuals have stepped into the property deals that corporate bankers have deserted. And that's responsible for more than half of all global big property deals. And you can see the impact of it in London with the Qatari royal family and the sovereign wealth funds from countries like Qatar now have played a really big role. The Olympic Village, One Hyde Park and the Shard are all bankrolled by the Qataris. Nine Elms, another huge privatised scheme proposed for South London, which will house the very high security US embassy. Malaysian sovereign wealth funds are playing a big part there, and actually one of the so-called public spaces not in this development will actually be called Malaysia Square. So this is how this development is now going ahead. So what's countering that? Well, this is actually the Aylesbury estate. And the Aylesbury estate is currently the subject of an occupation, not a very well reported occupation, but ongoing Occupy protesters are on the Aylesbury. And it's not just the Aylesbury, this was the Carpenter's estate not long ago, which was also briefly the subject of an occupation. This was Russell Brand, who got involved in the New Era estate just before Christmas and actually scored a success there. And that estate has been saved from the sort of process of eviction and demographic change. And actually we're starting to see housing become the focus of protest and activism. And I think when the issue gets to such a pitch, some sort of change is likely to follow. So I would take heart, the trends in London are really extreme, but actually it's begun to be the focus for a growing amount of political activity, and this was a big housing march which took place just a few weeks ago. I wrote a report about some of the tactics of local authorities working hand in hand with PR companies a couple of years ago, which I called Scaring the Living Daylights Out of People, the Local Lobby and the Failure of Democracy, partly because that was a quote from one of the PR companies who said that his tactics were to scare people into basically accepting development. The point I'm trying to make here actually is that when we're thinking of alternatives and what is it that we can possibly do. We're basically facing, I think, a real democratic deficit in the way that local government is behaving. And so much of what I've said in the talk today sounds like I'm saying, well, local authorities have given up their responsibilities for streets and public places. If only they would take back their responsibilities, you know, we might have a better, sort of more democratic city space. But actually, we've got a really big problem with local government, and indeed with central government. We have a huge democratic deficit. So part of the answers are going to have to come from some sort of reinvention of democracy and a much more participatory kind of democracy. And I haven't got the time here to have that discussion. But, you know, I think that's a sort of discussion that we're also starting to have. I'm going to end now on a final point, which may seem to have very little in common with everything I've been saying, but I want to end with something positive. And all the discussion that we've been having about these heavily securitized places with all their controls. Actually, there's another trend which is at play in our cities today, which is actually completely the opposite of this. And some of you in the audience may be familiar with the idea of shared space. This is Oxford Circus in London. And actually what's happened here and in other shared spaces is that all the controls are being removed from the environment. The fences, the railings and the pavements. And actually in Northern Europe, where this trend comes from, even the traffic lights are taken out of the urban environment. And when this was first proposed, highway engineers were like, you know, absolutely askance. How could you possibly want to remove the traffic lights? And what we've seen is that when you remove the controls from the urban environment, actually the level of accidents plummets, and these places become far safer because actually people are relying on that eye contact and that natural surveillance which automatically happens in places. When you remove the controls, you get that eye contact between people again, and places become much safer. Now, that argument, you know, people in that field never thought that they were going to win it in this country, and actually they have done. And what I would try to, what I will hope is by having this discussion and having this debate, actually we can start to say that argument could apply to security more generally. And we can start to have a debate about security which goes counter to the trend of thinking, you know, we need to have more CCTV and we need more protection from this, that and the other. Actually, if we remove some of these controls, we can in fact make places safer. And in the process, we can increase trust and create happier places as well. So there's been a long survey and I'll end it there.